Just weeks after a surprise election reshaped New York City politics, the city's new mayor is already confronting a problem no rally or slogan can solve: a multi-billion-dollar budget gap and a state government signaling there will be no easy fixes. I'm Emily Carter, a U.S. political and global affairs analyst, breaking down how power moves beyond the headlines. What's unfolding now is less about ideology and more about how governing actually works once a campaign ends. Zoran Mamdani entered City Hall with unusual momentum, backed by the Democratic Socialists of America, supported publicly by Bernie Sanders, and joined on the campaign trail by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. His candidacy energized voters across the city. Turnout surged, expectations followed. But within weeks, those expectations collided with something far less flexible than politics: the city's finances. According to New York City budget officials, the administration is facing a projected shortfall of more than $12 billion across the next 2 fiscal years. The gap reflects a mix of rising costs, previously under-budgeted programs, and structural spending obligations now coming due. And here's the constraint that rarely makes it into campaign speeches: New York City cannot raise major taxes on its own. Under state law, changes to income or corporate tax rates require approval from Albany, placing Governor Kathy Hochul at the center of the funding debate. Hochul, a Democrat navigating her own economic and political pressures, has publicly signaled resistance to broad tax increases, citing concerns about competitiveness and outmigration. That position sharply narrows the mayor's room to maneuver. So what happens when sweeping promises meet legal limits? Mamdani campaigned on ambitious proposals: expanded transit access, universal childcare, rent stabilization measures, and new public services, ideas that resonated with families facing rising costs across the city. The appeal was clear. But before any of it can move forward, one question has to be answered: not whether these ideas are popular, but whether they are fundable, lawful, and politically survivable. And that's where this story actually begins. Every new administration inherits challenges. But what makes this moment different is the timing. The fiscal constraints arrived almost immediately, before any major policy could even be drafted, let alone implemented. According to projections from the City Comptroller's Office, New York is facing a budget shortfall of roughly $12 to $13 billion spread across the next 2 fiscal years. That includes about $2 billion in the current year and more than $10 billion projected for the year that follows. This is not a one-time accounting error. Much of the gap stems from recurring costs that were previously under-budgeted: cash assistance programs, housing support, overtime spending, special education services, and shelter-related expenses that continue regardless of political leadership. In other words, these obligations don't disappear with a new mayor. They compound. And that's where the first major tension emerges. Because while the mayor can propose new programs, he must do so inside a budget already under strain, and within a legal framework that sharply limits how new revenue can be raised. Under New York state law, the city does not have independent authority to raise income or corporate taxes. Any meaningful tax change requires approval from the state legislature and the governor. That means even a popular mayor cannot act alone. Governor Kathy Hochul has been explicit about her position. In public statements, she has emphasized fiscal caution, competitiveness concerns, and resistance to broad-based tax increases, particularly at a moment when New York is already grappling with population shifts and business relocation pressures. That stance places the administration in a narrow corridor. On one side, campaign promises built around expanded services and cost relief. On the other, a state government signaling that new revenue will be limited, conditional, or off the table. This isn't unusual in American governance, but it is consequential because many of the proposals discussed during the campaign carry large recurring price tags. Transit subsidies, expanded childcare access, housing interventions, and new public services don't require funding once. They require funding every year. And even modest pilot programs, according to past budget analyses, tend to scale quickly once implemented, especially in a city as large and complex as New York. That reality forces a sequence of decisions every administration eventually faces. Do you delay? Do you scale back? Do you reframe promises as longer-term goals rather than immediate deliverables? Or do you push harder, risking conflict with state leaders, credit rating agencies, and budget watchdogs? None of those options are politically neutral. What's happening now is not just a policy debate. It's a test of leverage between City Hall and Albany, between ambition and authority, and between expectations set during a campaign and the constraints imposed by law and economics. And this dynamic isn't limited to New York, because similar tensions are playing out in major cities across the country, where rising costs, limited tax bases, and state-level oversight are reshaping what local governments can realistically deliver. That broader pattern is where this story expands next. What's unfolding in New York is not an isolated case. Policy analysts and budget officials have noted similar pressures emerging in major U.S. cities, where ambitious campaign platforms are increasingly colliding with fiscal limits, legal constraints, and state-level oversight. From Chicago to San Francisco to Los Angeles, local governments are grappling with the same underlying equation: rising costs for housing, childcare, transit, and social services, paired with tax systems that are often capped, shared with states, or politically difficult to expand. In many of these cities, the tension is not ideological, it's structural. Municipal governments are responsible for delivering services, but they do not fully control the revenue tools needed to fund large-scale expansions. Income taxes, corporate taxes, and major fiscal levers are frequently controlled at the state level. That creates a recurring mismatch between voter expectations and institutional authority. Economists and urban policy researchers have also pointed to another factor: mobility. While most residents do not relocate because of a single policy change, long-term trends matter. Investment decisions, business expansion, and workforce growth increasingly take place across state lines. Over time, even small shifts in where companies hire or where high-income earners choose to locate can have outsized effects on city tax bases. That reality forces city leaders into difficult trade-offs: push aggressively for new revenue and risk political resistance, legal obstacles, or economic pushback. Move cautiously and risk disappointing voters who expected rapid change. New York's situation is drawing particular attention because of its scale. The city's budget, workforce, and economic footprint magnify every decision. Small miscalculations become large problems quickly, and early signals from credit agencies, state officials, and budget monitors tend to shape what's possible long before legislation is passed. This is where governing diverges from campaigning. Campaigns reward clarity and ambition. Governing rewards sequencing, negotiation, and constraint management. So here's the question I want to put to you. Do you think city leaders should scale back major promises when legal and fiscal limits become clear, or push harder at the state level, even if that risks prolonged conflict and uncertainty? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because how cities answer that question may determine what urban governance looks like over the next decade. When fiscal limits collide with political momentum, the outcomes tend to follow familiar paths. Administrations reassess timelines. Promises are reframed as long-term goals. Pilot programs replace sweeping rollouts, and negotiations quietly shift from public rallies to closed-door budget talks. That process appears to be underway now. According to public statements and reporting, city officials are signaling that some initiatives may be delayed, narrowed, or restructured as budget discussions move forward. At the same time, state leaders are emphasizing fiscal discipline, signaling that any additional support will likely come with conditions, or not at all. None of this means campaigns were insincere, but it does underscore a central reality of governance. Authority is fragmented, resources are finite, and ambition must operate within institutional limits. For New York, the consequences extend beyond a single administration. Early budget decisions influence credit ratings, long-term borrowing costs, and investor confidence. They shape how state leaders engage with City Hall, and they send signals, not just to voters, but to businesses, unions, and public sector workers, about what kind of city New York intends to be over the next decade. Zooming out, this moment reflects a broader challenge facing American cities. Urban governments are under pressure to do more. address housing costs, expand social services, modernize infrastructure, while operating inside systems that constrain revenue, slow implementation, and diffuse responsibility across multiple layers of government. That gap between expectation and capacity is becoming one of the defining governance challenges of this era, and how leaders respond matters. Some will adjust their platforms, prioritizing incremental progress and institutional cooperation. Others will escalate conflicts, framing resistance as obstruction. In both cases, the outcome will shape not just policy, but public trust, and whether voters believe political promises remain credible. This is why stories like this deserve careful attention, not because they confirm any ideology, but because they reveal how power actually functions once campaigns end and governing begins. If you want more analysis that looks beyond headlines and explains how power, incentives, and institutions really work, consider subscribing to this channel, because understanding these dynamics is becoming essential, not optional, in modern politics.